Well, welcome to today's Lunch and Learn on sensory supports. My name is Lisa Davison, and I am a facilitator for LASARD, serving the northern and central part of the state. I'm joined today by my coworker, Allie, who's going to be monitoring the chat box. So if you have any comments or questions, you can drop them in there, and we'll do our best to answer them during the webinar or at the end as time allows. So who are we? We are the Louisiana Autism Spectrum and Related Disabilities Project within the Human Development Center at LSU Health Sciences Center in New Orleans. We support students, teachers, and districts throughout the state. We provide training, action planning, and coaching related to the education of students with disabilities. We started primarily working with students with autism, but we've expanded to include a much broader group of students and educators that we currently are working with. This is a snippet of our website. It's lasard.org. We have a variety of resources, as well as a new feature this year called Ask LASARD there at the top. And you can ask a question and one of our facilitators will respond to answer your question. You can also find the Lunch and Learn from today and previous month's Lunch and Learn videos under the News tab. And we have a tab with online resources as well that you'll be able to find a variety of visual supports and resources. In today's Lunch and Learn, we're going to talk about an overview of the sensory systems. We're going to talk about 3 basic types of sensory processing deficits and explore some strategies for addressing those deficits. I just want to mention that this is kind of a general overview and is by no means a replacement for consultation with an occupational therapist, either at your school, through the IEP process, or a private clinic if we have any families that have joined us today. So I want you to think about the specific environment that you need or the environment that you don't need, something that you tend to avoid when your to-do list looks like that first picture on the left. And then looking at those sensory systems in the middle, think about those aspects and what type of environment you need to be able to focus and accomplish important tasks. We don't really have time to discuss this in detail today, but I wanted you to just have that up there and to think about it as we go through the remainder of our session, how you need and use sensory information to accomplish tasks every day, or how sensory information may distract you. So what is our sensory system comprised of? We have 5 basic senses that we're all familiar with: sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. But we have a couple of other systems that we're going to spend a few minutes talking about that you may not be as familiar with. The first one we're going to talk about is the vestibular system, and it's a system that's responsible for receiving information as we move through our environment. It's located within the inner ear, and so it receives information from head movement as well as from gravity, and it's responsible for helping us maintain our balance and equilibrium in addition to our movement through space. The proprioceptive system, that's a system that processes information we receive from our joints and our muscles. So it lets us know our actual body position. It's our awareness of where we are in space. An example of this is knowing if your legs are crossed at the ankles or knees, or if your feet are flat on the floor without having to look down at your legs and feet to see what position they're actually in. This system also gives us information on how much force we need to complete an activity, and it helps us grade the amount of force. For example, when we pick up a glass of water versus a bag of dirt, we kind of know what that amount of force is needed. And that's from your proprioceptive system. So if the brain is not receiving accurate information from this system, you're going to see behaviors in children that are too rough, or maybe knocking peers over when they're just really trying to play. They have a hard time knowing where their body is in space and what their body's doing. So the last of the systems we're going to talk about is interoception. And this is a system that helps understand and feel what's going on inside our body. It's being aware of our own internal signs and symptoms, being hungry or thirsty, your heart racing, heavy breathing, that feeling that you get in the pit of your stomach when you're anxious or you're stepping outside your comfort zone. Those are some examples of interoceptive awareness. And how this affects our students is in their ability to self-regulate. It is them becoming overwhelmed with emotions or feelings that often manifest behaviorally in fight or flight responses. Many times we hear teachers and parents say, "It just came from nowhere," Well, oftentimes it's as much of a surprise to that child as it is to you because they didn't feel it building up. They just all of a sudden were overwhelmed. So what do we do with this information from these 8 sensory systems? It's called sensory processing, and it's registering or taking in information from all of those sensory systems, integrating or processing that information, and then followed by a response in order to behave in a meaningful and consistent manner. For many and most of us, our sensory systems and brains do this continually without us even thinking about it. But when the sensory systems don't receive the messages from the sensory receptors, or there's a misinterpretation in the brain that results in ineffective behavior, you have sensory processing disorder, which is a complex disorder of the brain. We all have sensory processing differences, and sometimes they can look like a sensory processing disorder, but we utilize strategies, hopefully daily, to maintain a healthy level of alertness and regulation so that we're successful. We have students with and without identified disabilities that may under or over register sensory information or be overly sensitive to it and avoid it. So it's important as teachers, parents, and school support personnel that we recognize some of the signs and symptoms so that we understand how sensory issues can affect behavior. This allows us to make basic general adjustments to the environment and the routines and to help guide us in determining when to make necessary referrals. So I want to think of our sensory system as this jar, and it being filled to just the right amount to hold the beverage without spilling, running over, or running out. The knob or the spout on it is somewhat of a control on how much we're able to fill or possibly not fill our jar. So if our jar fills or empties too slowly or too quickly, we might overflow it or we might not have enough in it. So we need our sensory jars filled to the right amount to allow adequate attention to the right information so that we can respond appropriately. When that doesn't occur, we then see those results in the form of behavior in our classroom or in our homes. So for those of us who seem to think that we have typical sensory systems, our brain processes all that sensory information coming in, and typically we are able to have an appropriate adaptive motor response. But there are times that we all become overwhelmed with sensory input. And so what we do is we just open the spout on that jar and we release some of that overstimulation. And we can do that in a variety of ways by taking a break, taking a walk, deep breathing, twirling our hair, tapping a pen, a variety of things that we do to release that. But it's important to consider external factors that can affect our ability to process sensory information that make it easier or harder to open that spout and release the pressure. And we also need to consider those internal factors that also affect our ability to control our sensory system. So like lack of sleep, constipation, nutritional deficits due to limited food choices, which we see a lot in the population of students we serve. All of these things are going to play a role in our ability to process sensory information. So let's talk about this first jar of sensory processing difficulty or deficits. And it's the low, poor, or under registration child. And depending on what source you look at, it's going to be called any of these things. I usually say low registration. But this student's jar has a small opening, and so the sensory input is missed, and therefore it takes a lot more of that input or water going into that jar for it to actually get into the jar. So this child needs more sensory input than a typical student. They have a high need for sensory input in order to respond. I'm not going to read all of those characteristics, but generally these children appear tired or disinterested. They're very likely because their sensory experiences aren't intense enough for them to notice and respond to them. Typically, these are the kids that fly under the radar. They don't have overt behaviors that catch our attention. And so it often goes undetected until later in preschool or early elementary years when difficulties learning or following directions begin to appear. And so for these low registration children, we need to increase the sensory input, whether it's the intensity, the frequency, or the type. And these are going to be alerting types of activities that we're going to talk about in just a minute. So our low registration children are going to need alerting activities, and we're going to talk more about that. Our sensory seekers are next, and these are your ones you're going to probably be familiar with. They have a high need for sensory input because that spout on the jar is always open. So the water just pours in and it continually flows out. Therefore, the jar is never or rarely fully filled. They typically try to meet their high threshold by actively seeking input. And you can see from the list of behaviors that are on the screen, basically they're in constant motion. Sometimes they have a hard time playing with other kids because they're too rough, or they're preoccupied with seeking sensory input. So they're not aware of their peers. They may seem to lack consideration for safety when playing, and they may run into the street or the parking lot without a second thought. They are the kids you find on your refrigerator, the bookcases, and just about anywhere else you can think of. Sensory seekers also have a hard time sitting still and focusing on activities from homework, classwork, even to eating dinner sometimes. Sensory seeking is often closely linked to the sense of proprioception and vestibular, which, if you remember, we said earlier was body awareness and movement. The sensory information, it's coming in, they're just not registering it and processing it. And so they don't have meaningful adaptive motor responses. So their sensory need is going to be for organization because they have the information, they're just not using it effectively. So we're going to look at organization activities for them. And then our third sensory processing disorder that we're going to talk about is the sensory sensitive child. They have a full jar and the spout is rarely open, so that jar just continually fills and fills until it overflows. So this child doesn't need a lot of sensory input to react, and they often attempt to manage their environment or the situations to avoid sensory input. Many times their jar is filled and just the slightest drip overflows it. So you might hear teachers and parents saying, nobody did anything to them. Well, it may have seemed minor, but it may have been just that last little drip that spilled the water over the edge. So with sensory sensitive children, you may see a meltdown or that fight or flight response, but you can also see them shut down or freeze to avoid input. This child has a low threshold for sensory input, and so the goal is to calm that sensory system regardless of their behavioral response. So you're looking at the cause, not the behavior necessarily when you're looking at the treatment activities for this student. It's important to note that one or more of the sensory systems that we listed previously can be involved, and you can actually see different types of deficits in different systems. So you might be sensitive to touch, but then have a high threshold or a sensory seeker for noise or for auditory. So it's not all systems are always involved and not in the same ways. So what do? In general, we want to reduce sensory overload for those overwhelmed or frustrated students, increase sensory input for students who need more stimulation, and then organize the level of regulation so that those students who are seeking input can reach that optimum level of regulation. That is always our goal, to get our students at the optimum level of sensory regulation so that learning can occur. So let's look back at the 3 sensory processing disorders and how we're going to provide, what type of activities we're going to provide. So that poor sensory registration or low registration, those students need to be alerted. They need more input. Remember, they have a jar with a small opening, so we need to ensure that their system is receiving the messages by more intense and alerting type of activities. For our sensory seekers, those activities are gonna be alerting type activities, but they need to be presented in a structured way so that the sensory system can organize. A seeker will run and jump and play for an extended amount of time, and they never seem to tire, and they seem to be more out of control the more they move. So to address their sensory deficits, you would think they need to calm because their behavior is so active. But actually, they need more input in a structured way with an emphasis on vestibular and proprioception, which, remember, is our heavy work and deep pressure, which is going to help them organize their sensory information. So then we have the sensory sensitive child, and they are have that overflowing jar. And so we want to calm their sensory experiences to reduce the stimulation on the sensory system. Lots of S's in all this. So now I want to just look for a minute at general categories and characteristics of activities in general and how they impact the sensory system. So in the middle of our slide, we're going to have the different sensory systems, and then to each side, the type of activity that is either alerting or calming. I think some of this is not going to be a surprise. We know that soft, neutral colors, dim lighting, white noise, soft, gentle sounds, we know that those are calming, but deep pressure and firm touch are also calming. Now, the reverse is true for alerting. The more bright colors, bold colors, light touch, loud sounds, quick beats, those are going to be alerting. So when we're talking about activities in a few minutes, we're going to be looking at how those activities are presented based on if we want to alert or calm. So when we're looking at smell and taste, minty, citrus, spicy, crunchy, cold is going to be alerting, whereas lavender and chamomile, chewing, sweet, warm things are going to tend to be more calming. Okay, so y'all might not be as familiar with the vestibular proprioceptive and interoception types of activities, but when they're fast moving and rotation, heavy resistance, skipping, jumping, running, those are going to all be alerting. Whereas slow back and forth movement, swinging, rocking, heavy weight, soft music, mindfulness and breathing, those are going to be more calming. And then again, with our sensory seekers, the nervous system is dysregulated and unorganized. So we want to provide them with movement, but in a structured way. It's the alerting type of activities followed by calming, but with the purpose to help them organize with an emphasis on vestibular and proprioception. Okay, so let's talk specifically about how do we do it. We kind of have a foundation of what kinds of activities we want to look at. But we do it by utilizing sensory breaks and or spaces as part of our routine schedule, not as a reinforcer or a reward, but as a preparatory strategy to calm, alert, and organize the sensory system so that they can focus on schoolwork, sports or hobbies, and building and maintaining relationships with both peers and adults. Some specific ideas for creating sensory spaces and meeting their needs is what we're going to talk about. And many of these activities that we're going to talk about can be done in either environment. I have them separated out like home strategies in school. They can be either environment. The ones for at home may require a little bit more planning for individualization and in the school environment, but certainly that is appropriate for many of our students if a whole class or in-class strategies not meeting their needs. We would want to be more specific and custom and individualize that activity. So let's look at alerting activities, which are for our low registration kiddos. And I have there in red at the top right, it's going to be fast, rotational, and resistive. I will caution you about rotation and spinning. It's a very powerful and long-lasting sensory input. And so we do not ever want to let a child spin for long periods of time. I would limit spinning to 10 times or less because over rotation can have a negative effect. So we really want to limit that spinning. Okay, so let's look at flexible seating and fidgets. Are they great ideas? And if they are in that resistive format, then they are going to be a more alerting activity. Additionally, I'm not going to read these lists to y'all, but rocking and swinging is also alerting if it's fast. Jumping, marching, bouncing on a yoga ball. There are many ways to alert students while they're sitting at their desk with leg raises or windmills. It's very easy to incorporate movement into your lesson to alert students, like for the whole class. You can do that by, if the answer is yes, stand up. You can practice skip counting with using your students as your manipulatives. So there's lots of ways to incorporate movement activities within your lessons. You can consider placement in the classroom or for homework. near a window or door where there's more light and noise, so that it's more alerting and keeps them at a higher state. These types of activities are a great way to alert your whole class after they've been sitting for a while and they need to rev their engines so they can focus more effectively. Now, when we talk about calming activities for that sensory sensitive student, again, that's going to be slow, rhythmical, and deep pressure. Some of my favorite strategies on here are the body squeezes or hugs, where you just 3 to 5 squeezes to each body part, like the shoulders, the arms, upper, lower legs, and the feet. And just, it's just squeezing those muscles. Rocking or swinging. Body socks are a great way to give deep pressure. You can find those online, but you can also buy a cotton jersey tube fabric from a fabric store, and it works great for giving deep pressure. In the classroom, stretches, book elbow curls, and flexible seating is a great way to provide slow rocking or bouncing. And you saw we talked about flexible seating for alerting. So it's just how it's delivered. If if you have some type of rocking and you're doing a slow rhythmical rock, it's going to be more calming. If you have a bounce yoga ball and you're bouncing on it, it's going to be more alerting. Wall pushes are a fun way to spread out your students and calm the whole classroom. Again, you wanted those to be slow and rhythmical, push the room and make it bigger because maybe it's getting too small, or, we're getting overwhelmed. So let's get up and let's move those walls. Fidgets are always a favorite. They've grown in popularity recently, so they're everywhere. We have even on our LASARD Facebook page some sensory ideas that are under $5, so they don't have to be expensive. Sensory bends are also a great way for calming, as long as the student is not sensitive to touch. If they are kind of sensitive to touch, you would want your filler in your sensory bends to be a larger, heavier item, like maybe a bean or a Lego or something like that, so that it's not so stimulating. When you're talking about placement in the classroom or at home for homework, you might want to consider putting them in a darker area with softer lighting or covering up some of the lights to decrease the amount of light. Soft music, lower noise and activity areas within your classroom or home would be ideal for these students. These calming activities are a great way to transition from recess, PE, music, those high energy enrichment activities, to prepare the student to transition into seat or table work. Okay, so for our organizing activities, remember, those are our sensory seekers. We're going to do alerting and then calming activities. They need to be structured though. So for example, instead of just letting them spin around and around in a chair, which we know we're not going to let them do for more than 10 times anyway, but instead of letting them do that, have them sit in the chair, rotate side to side, picking up a weighted ball or a book from one side and putting it in a bucket on the other side. Instead of just letting them randomly run around at recess, create relay races or do time sprints to specific distances, have more of a goal for their movement. Some other examples for this would be working a puzzle, laying over a small peanut ball. So you're getting some movement, but you're just not bouncing all over the place. They can bounce 5 times on a ball, stand up, and do 5 jumping jacks, and do that kind of as a like a little obstacle course or little fitness circuit. Another idea would be bounce once on a yoga ball, kick out your left leg, bounce one, kick out your right leg, and then do it twice, 2 bounces, 2 kicks kind of thing. So you're getting in that deep pressure movement, but it's structured. Heavy work is another term we use for organization of the sensory system, and it's really easy to incorporate at work and school, I think, by using errand running. So your child or your student can carry your groceries. They can take books to the library, that pull in a wagon to go on a walk, delivering supplies to the office by pushing or pulling a cart. Lots of ideas. You can get real creative here. And those students that need this, you can incorporate it as you're doing transitions from one activity to the next within your classroom. I mean, that's a perfect time for them to, maybe pick up the book basket and run it to the teacher next door, or to the library. So you can be really creative and incorporate it into your routine that you already have in your classroom, so it doesn't have to be disruptive. You always want to end these with a calming activity so that you're transitioning back to the classroom. So some deep breathing, some yoga. We have some website resources in just a minute that we'll show you. So here's some flexible seating options. You want to be sure to teach your students how to use them safely and correctly. Sometimes we forget that. I've put equipment in classrooms before, and if we don't do that, then we have balls and equipment all over the place. So most of these tend to be on the alerting side, but if you use them the right way, slow, rhythmical, that kind of thing, they can have a calming effect as well. So I've used them for both. Creating sensory spaces in the classroom or in the home are a great way to provide an area for regulation. And like I said, they can be in the home or the school environment. If you've ever attended our previous Lunch and Learns, or you've looked at our information on the internet or social media, or we work with you in your district, you're going to know this already, but we love visual supports. We recommend those all the time. And so I consider what visual supports you might need in the area. That picture on the bottom right shows the calm down corner, and it's got some breathing diagrams and some exercises. And so we definitely want to recommend those visual supports. Choice boards are a great visual support to help them choose what type of activity they need, especially a student that needs to calm might not be able to process and think about what kind of activity. So a visual support choice board is a great option. These choice boards are going to be available under the news tab on our website within probably sometime next week, but you will have opportunity to download these and use these if you'd like to. We also have these website resources, and I think Allie's going to put those in the chat box. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped a slide. Visual supports using your timers and your schedules. And then here are your website resources. And then collaboration is a big piece that you really want to get your OT involved, whether it's at home, privately, or at school. So I would really recommend you do that as well. And collaborate between your private and school therapists is always going to be a benefit to the students. So we kind of are almost out of time, but if you have a question or comment, I can stay on for a few minutes, or if there's something in the chat box we can talk about. I don't know if there's any questions, but we're right at time. Thanks for joining us today. If you're interested in the larger sensory professional development that we have, or any other professional development, you can get in touch with Julie Riley. We're working on developing packages for next school year. And again, thanks for joining us. Be sure to join May 12th for our next Lunch and Learn on summer transitions. And if you have a minute, if you would